Horsepower. These 5.0 Mustangs have plenty, but the steering system, there's a lot of opportunities there. Today on Tech Garage, it's a steering makeover with some control arms on this Mustang, so the steering and handling will perform just as good as the engine does. Welcome to Tech Garage presented by Advance Auto Parts. Well, our Mustang goes really well, but steering, not so much. And we're going to address those issues today. We're going to take you through the entire steering system, Steering 101, from diagnosis to inspection, all the way to replacement of parts. We'll start out by putting this new rack and pinion underneath the Mustang. Now this alone will stiffen up the steering, but we're going to take it a lot further. We're going to put some new tie rod ends in. While we're under there, Proform sent us these control arm bushings. We're going to go ahead and put these control arms on. We'll really give us that nice ride. Then we'll go ahead and we'll let the car down and we'll deal with the upper end. Up under the engine, we're talking about a power steering pump. We're going to put a power steering pump on along with an inline filter. We'll talk about that a little later. Real important to make sure that the filter's in there to keep the system operating properly. Also, while we're under the hood, we'll go ahead and address the belt, the tensioner, and we'll top it off with some fresh fluid. But you know, before we do anything, we need to start out with a good visual inspection, and I think Brian's got us underway.
John, who doesn't love a Fox Body Mustang? This is a highly capable chassis. We've seen it from weekend dragsters and track cars and autocrossers to show cars and daily drivers and everything in between. The one thing they all have in common is they've got to track safely, track truly down the road, and that is a great steering system, and that's what we're going to work on today. Now, first things you need to inspect when you're under here are, for example, the boots. They're both broken. This clamp broke away a long time ago. The end of the boot came off, and all the sand and dirt and everything this vehicle travels through has gone up inside to the inner tie rod joint. And in this case, there's sand coming out. That means it's like sandpaper. Every time you give input to the steering wheel, we're grinding that inner tie rod joint down. You wonder why this thing isn't tracking properly down the road? There's a starting point. Also, visually inspect the primary mounting bolts. Now, these bushings actually look pretty good. I don't think there's a lot of movement here from the primary bolts. Ultimately, these are going to need to come off. We've got to be sensitive about our high pressure power steering line and our return line. We're going to back them off up top so that ultimately we can pull this rack right down out. And we'll replace the new rack with the Moog tie rod ends that you saw John had. Those have Zerk fittings so we can keep this thing serviced and maintained over its life. So I'm going to get my buddy Mr. PB Blaster, hit some of these bolts and start the removal process.
Now your car may have different types of steering systems, so we're going to take a look at a few of them. We'll start out here with an older kind of beefy steering system. Heavier cars, trucks employ these. This is a gearbox steering system. It goes down here to some linkage called a parallelogram steering. And these are pretty simple. You just grab them, tug up and down. You look for some looseness. There's a lot of joints and flexibility in there. You can do a dry park test. You can put the car on the ground, turn it to the left or right, and look for any buckling on this system. Now our rack and pinions right here that we're going to put into the Mustang, this is a demo or cutaway of it. Brian was talking earlier about these seals. Now these outer seals right here, he mentioned the dust coming in here and the dirt. Well, it's going to eat these seals and you're going to get some leakage here. You also have a spool valve. The spool valve, this is the actual pinion that contacts the rack, and the spool valve directs fluid. And I can simplify it for you. Just think about it cut down the middle. If I shove fluid on this side and nothing on that, it's going to give driver assist in that direction, or I put a bunch of fluid here and not on that one, it's going to give it in the other direction. But that spool valve has to operate properly for that to happen. Then we went to actual electric power steering pumps. Well, what's an electric power steering pump? Exactly what it says. We took it off the belt. Power steering pumps have a lot of load on the vehicle. So by doing this, we're not driving it, it's driven electrically. It sends the hydraulic fluid down to the rack, and the rack works in the same way. Then the evolution went to electric power steering, and this is really cool. You actually have a steering angle sensor up in the column, and a steering angle sensor usually has two sensors built into it. One of them is a rotational sensor, and that tells the speed when you're turning it to the left or right. The other one's a torque sensor. Now that torque sensor tells how much effort you're doing it. And then what goes on, it tells the computer, and the computer tells the rack and pinion here, hey, turn to the left or right, how fast and how hard. Now that It's a little bit scary, I know what you're thinking, but think about it. You've probably been driving for years with a car drive-by-wire. I got a throttle right here. You push the throttle, and when you push the throttle, it goes to the computer, input goes over to the throttle body, and then it goes ahead and turns your throttle on. No direct linkage whatsoever. A little scary? Well, there's a bunch of fail-safe built into it. If one of these sensors on this rack and pinion, the steering system, or the throttle, they don't agree or they don't talk to each other, you're not going to go very far. It's going to shut the car down. Well, we should have the basics down pretty good. We need to get over to the fun stuff and start taking that rack and pinion out, and we'll do that as soon as we return with more Tech Garage.
What component inside a rack and pinion directs fluid to the appropriate places? A. Spool valve, B. Rack, C. Pinion, or D. Tie rod? The correct answer is A. The spool valve directs fluid to either side of the rack assembly to aid in driver assist. This edition of Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts, is being brought to you by Performance, over 1,000 parts that perform. Stage 8, the world's best locking fastener. Steele Rubber, quality crafted rubber parts and weather stripping. And by Advance Auto Parts. Let's get you back to the garage.
Welcome back to Tech Garage. Tell you what, the steering rack is just about ready to come out. We've got one primary bolt loose, second one still intact to hold everything steady. We've got the driver's side tie rod disconnected, the passenger side loosened up. Let me drop it. Now, here's a little tip. My dad always said use the right tool for the job. Well, we've all used this to remove a tie rod, let's admit it. But a pickle fork action just like this on a tool that it will separate these can be very helpful if you're saving these tie rod ends or you just want some mechanical advantage in getting them off. That was very helpful. So that's loose. About the only remaining connection we've got here is the steering shaft itself where it marries up to the rack. And there's splines there and there's a strap. We've got the bolt removed on the strap, but to help create a little separation with the splines, big fan of mechanical advantage. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get that up around the splines so that when we start muscling this rack down out, it may separate just a little bit easier. So one primary bolt left to go, and we'll be ready to get this rack over to John for a little bit of an inspection. But John's close by, because I got to tell you, this might take two guys. This might be a two-guy job, so get your buddy if you need it. Okay, second primary bolt is out, and I'm going to start working this loose. All right, there's the bolt. Now, the rack should roll, but you may need just a little bit more encouragement. Again, right tool makes a big difference here. Try to create a little movement. That PB blaster's working down those splines right now. That should help our cause. Second set of hands here might be helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, you got this thing all separated, ready to come out of here.
Yep.
Looks like we just got to pry it over here a little
All right.
bit. You got the bolt holding. Now, when you're under here, it's probably a good idea just to go ahead and do a good visual inspection. You got all the other components right here. There you go. You're almost off a little more. You're on a little tab here.
Yep.
There it goes. Oh, the bushings on there. Perfect. Well, we're going to go ahead and replace those bushings. So, got to remember, these cars are old. You're going to have some problems with this. It's no big deal. While you're under here, take a look at the suspension components. You see our sway bar links and everything else that's under here, along with the suspension components. A good idea to go ahead and take a look at that while you're here.
And we disconnected the return line in advance. We did that down at the bottom. The pressure line we actually disconnected up at the pump. Honestly, it was just easier access. With those pre-disconnected, it allows the rack to come down in your hands.
You know what, Brian? We need a new rack.
I think so. Thanks.
All right, well, we got the old rack, but there's a few things we have to do before we install the new rack and pinion assembly. And Cardone sent this rack right here, which is ground, polished, it's ready to go. Remember we talked about that spool valve earlier? Well, the spool valve is actually computer balance, which is going to give you real nice when you're turning to the left or right. Now, we'll start out with the bushings. We want to transfer the bushings over from the old rack to the new rack, unless it comes with them. You can pop them out right here. I have both of these. You can pop them out, or Cardone supplied us with the actual bushings. What you want to do is just take them and go ahead and replace them on the rack. Now, another consideration is the tie rod ends. Remember we popped the tie rod ends off on the car? Well, you can see we got that side done, but over here, we'll focus on these. This tie rod end right here connects over to the spindle, and that's what actually turns the car. So unless you're replacing with new tie rod ends like we are, you're gonna have to take this off. So what we're gonna do here is basically just break this locking nut loose on the tie rod end. Once we break that loose, we can go ahead and unscrew the tie rod, the whole assembly off. Now I'm going to leave that lock nut there for a second because I'm going to show you a trick. What you want to do is you actually want to come over and you want to measure the threads. You can count the threads, or you can go get you some white out and put some white out right there. Now, why am I going to do all that? Well, these threads are going to determine where the wheel sits. That's an angle called toe. And I have my two tires right here. Now we can take these tires, and that tie rod's going to control the toe in. That's called positive toe. That's going to scuff the tires from the inside out. And then there's toe out. All right, when I'm toe out like this, that's going to scuff the tires just as bad. It's going to go like that, and it's called feathering wear. And toe is one of the critical tire wearing angles, so you want to make sure you get that right. Now we'll just come back over here, take this jam nut off. We're going to take this one to an alignment shop. No matter what you do, you're going to get it close, but because it's one of the most critical wear and tire angles, you still want to get the car aligned. Take that back to about where it was. And then what we can do is we can take our new Moog tie rod end. Our new Moog tie rod end actually comes with a Zerk fitting. We'll put that in because we want to supply grease, and that's nice because that makes it last even longer. You can get under there and service it and make sure it's in good shape. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to put that right back to where it was. Like I said, only to get it close. You still got to get in alignment. But believe it or not, if you're driving to the alignment shop and it's 2 or 3 miles away and this isn't close, you'll scuff some brand new tires before you even get it there. Then we'll just come back and snug this up and tighten it up. Make sure that's good and tight. All right, so we got our tie rod ends in, our bushings on. Last piece of the puzzle is the nut. When you're putting it back on the spindle, they supply you with this castellated nut and a cotter key. Think about that for a minute. This is controlled to your wheel. That's the only control you have over your wheel. So make sure you put the castellated nut back on. Just reverse the procedure, follow your torque specifications. This Mustang will be steering like brand new, but we have to address those control arms, and Brian's working on that right now.
Well, it never goes quite as planned, does it, John? Especially on a 25-year-old vehicle like our Mustang here. Now, we're removing lower and upper control arms on the rear end of the vehicle to create a lot more stability. Now, at the top of the show, we talked about 2 key words, contact patch. With worn bushings and worn control arms and sloppier tolerances, we're not going to get maximum traction at every corner of the vehicle. Now, all the work we've done on the front end to solidify the steering, now we're going to complement it with the back end to keep that rubber in contact with the road no matter what the driving conditions. The upgrade is the ProForm control arms, polyurethane bushings, 120,000 steel liner inside. These things can handle a substantial load that the factory control arms can't. So I'll get this side buttoned up, move over to the passenger side. We're going to take our time back here because this is big work, as well as the steering rack. So stay with us on Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts. Welcome back to Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts. We're at the final stage of our steering system overhaul, and that is replacing the power steering pump. Now, a couple tips along the way here. We're replacing the serpentine belt with a new quality belt from Dayco. We're going to replace the tensioner, the whole tensioner assembly, as there's a lot of wear and tear on the springs inside this. Now, the next step is to remove the pump, but before we do that, we've got to remove the pulley. And I want you to resist the temptation to not use a puller. If you don't have a puller, just about any automotive aftermarket parts store has these as a loaner tool. You're going to need that to get a uniform press of the pulley off of the old pump, as well as pressing the pulley back onto the new pump. And when you think about a lot of today's vehicles actually have plastic pulleys, you don't want to fracture that or crack it. You really need that to perform properly to get maximum performance out of that power steering pump. So I'm going to go ahead and back this off. The couple turns will press this pulley off, and just take your time here. And it comes straight off. Once we get the pulley off, we only have a few bolts to get the power steering pump fully removed. And at that point, with a new pump in place from CARDONE, we've got all the hydraulic pressure we need to get that new rack and pinion system working properly. And there's the old pulley. Comes right off. Keep that fully intact. Now it's just 3 bolts to remove on the face of the power steering pump. Not hard to do.
Now, before we put the new pump on here at Tech Garage, we're going to take a look inside. But first of all, the pump's job is to deliver hydraulic pressure either to that rack and pinion or a gearbox. It's the heart of the system. You know, it only takes 3 horsepower to deliver 1,500 pounds of pressure, and here's how it works. It comes in here through a return line. The return line creates a vacuum, and then through here, these little vanes spin around. As it goes around, the chamber gets smaller and it pressurizes, and it goes through a control valve, and then it goes out either to that rack and pinion or a gearbox. Now, our new pump CARDONE sent us, this exceeds OEM form, fit, and function. You got the seals right here, which are high temperature seals, and even more importantly, it's got a precise bearing, and we'll talk about that a little later when we do belt alignment, because that's huge. Also on the box, you have these 3 F's, fluid, flush, and filter. Very, very important. I'll show you why. Right here in 1968 to 72, the tolerances were big. Get a little debris in there, not so bad. Come over to this one here, it's a lot tighter. You start getting debris in there, we're gonna start wearing the walls, you're gonna have problems with your pump. So what do you wanna do about that? Well, you can add a filter. That's what we're gonna do on our Mustang. We're coming down here, and we're gonna go in series with the flow back to the return to the pump, and we're gonna go ahead and start catching some of that debris on the way out. Now, we can flush it also. You can get it professionally flushed, or you can just take your return line off, crank it over, pump it into a bucket down on the driveway. That's the low pressure side, so you'll be safe, but it's important to top it off with fresh fluid and keep it filled while you're doing that. Now, it's a good look at a pump. We need to get this one on the Mustang.
Okay, there's the old pump. Now we have the new CARDONE pump set up. We've got the return line pre-plumbed here and clamped with the filter in line as promised. We've got a little bit of surplus of return line because I'm not sure exactly how much we're going to need down on the bottom end. You might remember the high pressure line was pre-connected to the rack, so it's in there. We're going to go ahead and leave this cap in till the last possible minute to connect the high pressure line. You don't want any debris getting down in the new pump. And remember, if you're replacing just one component on this system, pre-flush this whole system before you install the new pump and get any debris in it. So 3 bolts hold the pump on. I'm going to work my way down here, and I've got the pulley press set up as well so that I can uniformly, slowly push that pulley back on right in place, right where it wants to be. 3 mounting bolts for the pump. Again, follow torque specs if it calls for it. Okay, I'll finish up installing the pump and ultimately the pulley, and make sure you use the press and press it on uniformly after the break. We're going to take care of the belt and the tensioner, so stay with us on Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts.
When do most manufacturers recommend changing your power steering fluid? A, 10 to 15,000 miles. B, 100 to 120,000 miles. C, 40 to 60,000 miles. Or D, every 6,000 miles. The correct answer is C. Additives break down in power steering fluid, which is why most manufacturers recommend fluid changes between 40 and 60,000 miles. This edition of Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts, is being brought to you by Dustless Blasting. It's the future of surface preparation. AP Laser, leading the way. CARDONE, the new and remanufactured auto parts leader. And by Advance Auto Parts. Let's get you back to the garage.
Welcome back to Tech Garage. Now before we put our belt on the Mustang, let's understand a little bit about them. And I got a cool demo here to show you. A belt is a serpentine belt, and it's driven here by the harmonic balancer, which is attached to the crankshaft. It drives all the accessories. It could be a water pump, a pulley, an alternator, but it's important that it's riding and tracking right. You may have a belt that's squealing. I'll give you a couple tricks. You can take a spray bottle test here with some water, it's called. Just simply spray it on the long span of the belt right there, and the water acts as a lubricant. So if the noise gets worse, you're going to need a tensioner and a belt because it's actually slipping. If the noise goes away for a second, you might have an alignment issue. And you can go down to the auto parts store and get one of these. This is a Dayco laser tracker. This is really cool because what you do is you strap it to the pulleys and you can run it. You can look at the laser light on all the different pulleys and make sure that they're all in alignment. Because if they're not, you're going to wind up with an issue like this. This belt here is totally worn out. Now the new belts today, EPDM material, different way you have to check them. Remember the old belts used to be the neoprene belts? You can count the cracks here. Well, you can't do that anymore. So what you need to do is get a gauge down there and go through and just measure the belt, make sure it's all right. It may last up to 100,000 miles on today's vehicles. All that's left, Brian, is you got to take our belt, which is EPDM material, and put it on that car.
Awesome, thanks. I've got the new tensioner on, I've got it torqued, we're all set to go. We'll route that new belt in, install the battery tray, reinstall the battery. I got to tell you, I'm looking forward to the test drive, and I think all we've got left is the email question of the week. John, Nick from Jackson, Mississippi emailed us, and he's got a car that he says is all over the road. He's constantly working the steering wheel to keep it driving straight. Do we think an alignment will fix it?
It might, but you know, the first thing you want to do, Nick, is go out there, put 2 fingers and the weight of your arm on the steering wheel. If it's still pulling it out of your hand to the left or the right, it may need alignment, or there could be a couple other things. We put that pump in that Mustang today, made all the difference in the world. Pumps can cause a lack of pressure and maybe could cause a car to pull. Also this rack and pinion. You remember when we studied that spool valve inside of there? If we had too much pressure redirected to the wrong side of this rack, it's going to want to push the rack in that direction each time. That's going to cause a pull. And we also stress the importance of the mounting bushings. We got to get them mounting bushings in there, and that rack's got to be tight or you're going to have some wander and some pull.
On our Fox Body Mustang, we had issues with the rear control arms. I mean, look at the difference in the old control arms to the new beefier ones we installed from Proform and polyurethane bushings. Believe it or not, a rear end that's got alignment issues will affect it that way.
It'll pull it. Made a big difference on our Mustang. You know, I got to test drive that, and that suspension's is tight, and that steering's is tight, and almost got as much horsepower as that engine's got now.
Awesome.
I'm confident that Mustang's going to handle much better and be able to handle that horsepower. Now, for more on Tech Garage, follow us on Twitter. And until next week, from our garage to your garage, thanks for watching Tech Garage.
Production assistance for Tech Garage is provided by Chipola College, located in Marianna, Florida. Founded in 1947, Chipola was recently ranked as one of the top 3 community colleges in the United States.